The situation in Ukraine, a standoff in Nevada, a Pulitzer Prize for the Snowden story, and racially charged comments from the sports legend. I'm Zandila Mkwanazi, and this is The Square Circle. Hello and welcome to The Square Circle. I'm your host, Zandila Mkwanazi. Joining us today are journalists Gregory Clay, Brianna Deutsch of the Daily Caller News Foundation, Nick Brana, formerly of the Terry McAuliffe campaign, and political consultant Marcio Coimbra. Our first topic today is the ongoing situation in Ukraine. This week, armed pro-Russian militia took control of several government buildings in eastern Ukraine, which Ukraine later took back. But it seems clear that Moscow is behind the latest aggression. Clearly, the sanctions imposed after Russia's invasion of Crimea have not kept Vladimir Putin at bay. So Marcio Coimbra, what do we do now?
Sandil, the situation now is very complicated. We see now that these sanctions are not working, the diplomacy is not working, everything that is done until now is not working. So Ukraine is not part of NATO. There's not a military option in the table, and Vladimir Putin is doing whatever he wants to get whatever he needs at this time. So we are in a very complicated situation, and the solution, I think, it's inside Ukraine. The solution doesn't look like an outside solution. So we have a divided country in Ukraine, the eastern part and the western part of Ukraine. So if you don't reach an agreement, the country is going to fall apart with the regional differences that they have in those two different places. In every election, one of the places is not going to be happy. If the West wins, the East is not going to be happy. And on the contrary, the same. So what we have now, it's a very difficult situation, but the solution doesn't look to me now as an international solution, but a national solution with probably more autonomy to some regions of Ukraine in order for them to be able to see the country fall apart. That's what I see now.
So Marcio's explained what should happen socially. Nick, what do you think that should happen in terms of international intervention?
I think you're right in terms of granting greater autonomy to some regions. I think we need to ask ourselves the question that precedes everything that we've been doing, and that is, what is our role here to begin with, and what should it be? Do we really have as much of a vital interest here? The Europeans, the EU does. They receive 40% of their natural gas from Russian state oil companies that pass through Ukraine. They're dependent upon that. I think that Russia has, however, secured its fundamental interest in the area. It secured Crimea. It's managed to annex it. That was its fundamental interest in the area. That gives it access to Black Sea ports and to Black Sea oil. Those were its vital interests. It's done that. Now it doesn't have any more of an incentive, Putin and Russia, to annex more of the country. I don't think so. I think that would actually harm his cause there. But he still does have incentive to have a rather unstable Ukraine, a rather destabilized Ukraine from that perspective. So while I don't think that the Russians have been tremendously at the helm of these kinds of militia movements taking over cities and city government buildings, I do think that they haven't been doing anything to stop it. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, they've been pleased to see it happen.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah. Furthermore, Marcio was talking about how complicated the situation is, and now we have this development involving these masked men who are passing out leaflets and flyers seeking out all Jewish people in the region wanting them to register, and mention real estate and holdings and all this. And, this reminds you, of course, of the 1930s in Germany with the Nazis. The anti-Semitic situation is going on. And that's very scary. Is anyone trying to address this situation in particular? I know the U.S. ambassador this week denounced those actions. But what about the rest of the world? Because apparently Eastern Ukraine has a history of anti-Semitic activity. Am I right here?
So are you under the impression that nothing actually can be done? And actually I would like to also, let me rather pose a question to Brianna. Do you think there is a way that we can stop Vladimir Putin?
Well, the question is, I think Marcio and Nick both brought up really good points. First of all, you brought up the point that there's a lot of internal conflict in the different regions of Ukraine. There's almost a lot of different tribal identities within the area. It's kind of an internal family feud that's really hard for even neighboring European countries to understand, especially the United States. Nick brought up a good point, and that question is, what's our place in this whole situation anyways? And I guess what's really frustrated me lately is a lot of the news is focused on what is the United States going to do next? What is President Obama going to do? Is he going to announce tougher sanctions? And I don't necessarily think this is the battle we should be at the forefront of. This is on Europe's turf. Of course, the elephant in the room is that Europe's not going to take, the lead here because they do have a lot of interest here. They have a lot of investment in Russian oil. You have BP coming out and, their lobbyists going to Parliament and saying, hey, if we do really get involved and sanction Russia, there are going to be severe consequences. So as a default, a lot of the responsibility has fallen on the United States, and I don't think that's our responsibility. And in regards to what we should do about Putin, whenever we get involved in conflicts with Putin, we just end up embarrassing ourselves. And so I think, we should try to avoid that at all costs. And, perhaps sort of let Ukraine figure out their own issues or let Europe take the lead.
So does that mean that Germany or the EU is supposed to be the only people who participate in this, or do you actually see U.S. having the space?
I think it's a problem that we see now, that we need to remember that President Bush, in the past, he was pushing for Ukraine to get into NATO really fast, and Europe was against it. In the UK, Germany, and France, I think now they're rethinking their position of the past, that if Ukraine was part of NATO, they would have a military option.
How valid is the agreement that was reached, between the European Union and the United States, Ukraine, and Russia that John Kerry announced yesterday? The White House seems to be very skeptical about that.
I think they're very skeptical about anything Russia says.
It seems to have been more of a condemnation of actions that these kind of militants were taking in the eastern part of Ukraine. Saying something about what you said too, about the fact that these anti-Semitic leaflets were distributed on the registrations. When you really trace that story blew up yesterday, and I traced it. And when you do that, it really came out of a few leaflets that were given. There's been no enforcement. There's nobody's even going to try to enforce this, and it was really built up by Israeli news. So the whole thing is kind of. It's more of a sham in reality. It was distributed, but nobody. It certainly doesn't trace back to Putin. It's even questionable about whether it traces back to these militants who have taken over these buildings.
So then this brings us back to the same point. Do we then lean back and allow them to solve their own problem, or do we insist that they come to an agreement that we will help them enforce?
I think in regards to them finding an agreement, I think that does sort of have to come from within. We obviously want to have them reach an agreement that we can agree to as well. But in regards to what we can do, frankly, I'm happy there's no military option on the table. And if we do go forward with sanctions, so far what we've done is we've placed sanctions on some of, Russia's wealthiest men. And I mean, they almost made a mockery of that and put sanctions on some, congressmen here in the States. And I mean, it actually has impacted Russia's economy. A lot of money has been flowing out of there. Investors see it as a less stable economy. But if we really want to dismantle it anymore, I think we have to take over enforce sanctions on the financial sector more as a whole, perhaps put more sanctions on banks. And I don't necessarily support that. I actually don't support that.
As a fundamental moral principle here, though, whenever we're discussing the actions, the aggressions of others, I think we're right to condemn that. And our government, our leaders, John Kerry, Barack Obama, are right to condemn that. But as a fundamental moral principle, you should examine your own actions at the same time. And what we're doing right now, frankly, is using drones in a way that is tantamount to extrajudicial assassination and murder. And the amount of people who've died from that is hundreds of innocent. Those are innocent people. 4 people have died in this conflict. So we should keep that in perspective.
I don't see how you relate that to putting sanctions on financial institutes, though.
Well, if loss of life is a principle that you're judging this by.
And sanctions wouldn't help. More sanctions. We saw that sanctions didn't play any role, didn't stop Putin. And the military options, as far as we may not like it, but if you have that on the table, is a way to make pressure.
They have more leverage than we do because of their state owned. Yeah.
All right. With that said, I'd like to remind our audience that they can submit their questions to guests on our website at www.publicsquare.net, and we'll answer as many as we have time for at the end of the show. Moving on to our next story, this week there was a tense standoff here in the United States. Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy, having lost a land dispute against the federal government in court, stood his ground along dozens of armed citizens. Federal agents eventually backed off, citing public safety concerns. Now, apart from the question of who's right and who's wrong, does this episode concern you at all? Brianna Deutsch, is this democracy in action, or does it encourage people who want to stand against the government to do exactly that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, this story has certainly been at the forefront of the headlines in the past couple of weeks. And initially, when you look at it at face value, it's almost reminds you of a Western movie. You have kind of this clandestine rancher, and then you have the big bad government. Unfortunately,
in the old days, it would be the railroad.
Right. Yeah, or cowboys and Indians. Unfortunately, when you dig down into the nitty-gritty details, the story isn't actually as charming as you would hope it would be. I mean, Bundy, he seems like a great guy. He seems like a hard-working rancher. He obviously, he values his family ranch. Unfortunately, he doesn't have legal rights to the land. He hasn't for some time now, and there's been various lawsuits going back and forth. They've lost them. This has been an ongoing issue. I think, unfortunately, in the end, he will lose this fight. But if there's any silver lining, I think this brings up a different issue, and that's the fact that the federal government owns 84% of Nevada's territory. 84%. That's insane. And then you look at Nevada's unemployment rate. They have one of the highest unemployment rates in the country. They have an 8.5% unemployment rate. So how are you supposed to make an honest living as a rancher if you don't have rights to any of the land? I mean, it seems like in Nevada, you either have to be a gambler, you have to dance on a pole, or work in a casino.
So, Gregory, do you want to chime in on this?
Yeah, well, see, here we go again with states' rights. And history tells me that whenever you hear those two words, i.e., states' rights, quite often it results in some type of separatism. Because I remember during the civil rights movement, going back in the 50s and 60s, a lot of the southern states were touting what? States' rights. Why? Because they wanted to maintain segregation. They wanted legal segregation to stay in place. They did not essentially recognize the federal government. Just like what's happening in Nevada. He doesn't recognize the federal government as an entity. He only recognizes states' rights. Federal government doesn't exist as far as he's concerned. Very similar situation happened during the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. states' rights. And we want to maintain segregation. Because back then, any federal law that was passed to promote civil rights was, of course, denounced. And a lot of states back then essentially participated in imposition and nullification, where you defy the federal government and federal laws. When President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, several states said, no, we're not going for that.
Okay, so Marcio, do you think there should be a pullback from the federal government then? Do you think that Mr. Bundy should be allowed to run his ranch or get even more land if he sees fit?
I think in this issue, I'm very skeptical about the federal government always, and I tend to be on side of the people instead of the government. But in this case, as we have like a court order, we have a decision, we have something that's going on. I think we should respect that. I think we should go from there. I think that's the most important thing. And one of the things that scares me the most is what Brianna says, that 84% of the land is owned by the state. So
by the federal government.
By the federal government. And so that is like a big problem.
So Nick, what do you have to say about this?
I share a skepticism of the federal government in all states. But in this case, I think the discussion should begin with Cliven Bundy's position here. And his position is that the federal government is a non-entity, doesn't exist.
Right.
That there are 50 different countries here in what we call the United States.
Right.
And that really reveals how extremist this is.
Right.
And the fact that but it goes further than that for me. The fact that it has received so much attention from our media, and particularly the right wing of our media, is a reframing of the extreme of the political debate. When you move the extreme to that far, all of a sudden things like defunding Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security look reasonable. And that's what I think it's really about. It's about making less these already extremist economic positions, particularly on the right wing, in the conservative parties here in the United States and the Republican Party, look more moderate and look more reasonable. I think that's what it's about.
I think we've all agreed around this table that this is a really big double-edged sword. Also this week, the Washington Post and The Guardian won a Pulitzer Prize for the Edward Snowden domestic spy story. But not everyone is congratulating them. Some have pointed out that Snowden leaked sensitive information to China, Russia, and other hostile countries and harmed U.S.'s national security. Nick, Brianna, do you think that the Post and The Guardian deserve these Pulitzer Prize for what they've done?
I do. I absolutely do. We were just discussing skepticism about the state is healthy. I think there's a very basic principle here in question, and that is, does the state have to rectify its decisions, justify its decisions to the people? That's what's at stake here. What we've seen in this question of NSA surveillance and what he won the Pulitzer, and also a Polk Prize in journalism for, is that the state has been violating the law, the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, in order to spy on all of us. Mm-hmm. And specific individuals in the Obama administration appointed by him, people like James Clapper, have lied. Keith Alexander also as well, director of the NSA, and James Clapper being the director of national intelligence, they have lied under oath repeatedly in Congress. That's a crime. I think that we should begin from the position that our elected officials are the first ones to be held accountable, because that's what Snowden and that's what Glenn Greenwald and that's what Laura Poitras have been written to reveal, is the state's violation of the law to begin with.
But didn't Edward Snowden break the law himself?
He did, but he did to reveal the state's violation of the law. Mm-hmm. He would have never had to do that. That's also a principle that was codified, in fact, after Nuremberg. After the Nuremberg trials, is the Nuremberg principles establish conscientious objection, that a government, a state, cannot ask you to violate the law, cannot ask you to violate people's civil liberties and people's universal human rights.
Okay, so you don't view the Washington Post and the Guardian as quote-unquote enablers? In other words,
exactly.
Aiding and abetting.
They basically helped him carry out the story, leak this information, and ensure that the nations that would possibly want to harm the U.S. or any other nation around the world, and our information actually gets facilitated across every single border that there is.
Only if you consider journalism a crime. I mean, if you standardize that as a principle, then you're really leaving the definition of what's up to the people to know to states, and I think that's a terrible principle. I think also, like I was saying, if you're going to predicate this on security, which is what our government has been doing, then you need to examine, is it our security really what's at stake here? Is it benefiting? And what you see from testimony from John Ingle, who's Deputy Secretary of the NSA, and from other examinations into this, is that they have not been able to show a single instance where this has prevented a terrorism case.
Let's bring some of our other panelists in. Where would you draw the line?
Right. Well, I think this is a complicated issue. It really is because, on one hand, the president's job, his ultimate job, is to protect our security, right? And obviously we're facing new threats that we didn't face in the past. And so that is something we have to consider. Also, there's the issue of civil liberties and, what's more important than our civil liberties. So where can we both protect our national security and our civil liberties? That's a good question. You brought up the point that so far, from what we know, the NSA, their programs have not really prevented any major terrorist attacks. And The Guardian, the Washington Post, and whatnot, when they wrote about these stories, I mean, they didn't just throw information out there. I mean, they checked with people. I mean, they're good journalists. One question I would pose to everyone else at this table, though, is, we do criticize the National Security Agency for doing these things, but yet Google, when you go on Gmail, Facebook, they are doing similar things. In fact, I mean, they're more invasive to your privacy.
They're tracking you.
Of course, you're using their service, right. But you also protect. I mean, you also expect the government to protect you as well. So, I mean, do you guys see a comparison? Is there a reason why? I mean, some people have been critical of the Googles and whatnot, but do you think the conversation should be equally as critical to the Googles as it is to the NSA?
Marcio.
But Facebook and Gmail, they are providing information for the government as well. So,
because the government is,
Yeah, so that's the basic thing. What is this country founded? It is founded on the principle of liberty. So I totally agree with Nick. I mean, this country is founded about freedom and not about surveillance. So if you change that, if you think that we need to open up our freedoms to have more security, we will end up with no freedoms at all. So I think we should respect the Constitution, we should respect the principles and the Founding Fathers. That's what this country was based upon. We cannot change that in any circumstance. And I mean, we can understand the rules sometimes, and sometimes we have different scenarios, but the basis of violating our civil liberties, our freedom in this country, if we let them change this, they won the war. They changed this country. And we cannot let them change the United States of America.
With that said, Gregory, what do you think?
Well, my thing is this. It's not like the United States is Nazi Germany. I'm going back to the 30s again, when the Nazis imposed the Nuremberg laws against Jewish people. And we live in a totally different society now. Why? Because of September 11th. Okay? I mean, there's a price to pay to be safe. That's my thing. Furthermore, if you have nothing to hide, I don't see what the problem is. I mean, like me, I have nothing to hide. And another thing, going back to Edward Snowden, one thing that really gets me about this dude is people calling this cat a whistleblower. Now, if you're a true whistleblower, you don't blow the whistle and take off for Hong Kong. That's like me blowing the whistle on somebody going to Antarctica, someplace. You should stay in your country, and face the music, as they say.
But I mean, essentially, he was under threat, and I think that's what really caused him to basically flee. I don't think he had much of a choice, because he was going to be held by the U.S. government, and he probably would have been a liability for the U.S. government long term. from foreign neighbors.
But he still could have faced the
information.
music, though.
He in fact said, though, he himself said in his initial interview, and all the journalists who speak to him have always attested to this, that he planned on staying in the United States until the Bradley Manning, now Chelsea Manning case. After seeing the way that Chelsea Manning was treated by our own government, she was held in a tiny prison cell, windowless prison cell, and essentially tortured. And that's what convinced him to leave. It's that, but it's also one more thing. Mm-hmm. It's the fact that under espionage trials here, there is no whistleblower stipulation. There is no legal protection for having blown the whistle.
That's really
so you essentially are neutered from being able to defend yourself whatsoever.
Yeah, your point very quickly.
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of things we can take away from this. One, I think everyone realizes that this is the biggest story in journalism of the year. People didn't know what the NSA was, essentially, before this leaked. And now it's on the front pages of the news every day, and it's basically started a movement. So I think we can all agree on that. I think the other big takeaway is, I think the fear is if we allow the NSA to continue some sort of similar program, to what extent do we allow it to continue that program? I think people are afraid of the precedent. Just allowing them to have that, what type of precedent does that set? Going to your fears, this could escalate into something much greater where we lose our civil liberties, and I think that's the debate that people will continue to have.
Okay. I have to move on to our last story. Baseball legend Hank Aaron was in the news this week for his comments for some of his racially charged comments. Last week, Aaron compared Republicans opposing President Barack Obama to the Ku Klux Klan. He said back then they had hoods. Now they have neckties and starched shirts. Aaron is now getting hate mail for some of those comments. The same kinds of people that were chasing him during the home run record are the same people who are labeling him as a hater. So now we're going to have to ask you, Mr. Clay, where are you on his comments? Do you think they were out of line?
Well, a couple of things. Hank Aaron, back in 1974, when he broke Babe Ruth's record on April 8th, 74, this is the 40th anniversary of that feat, was under siege, basically. He dreaded having to play back then because of all the hate mail he received. Why? Because so many people did not want Hank Aaron, a black dude, to break Babe Ruth's record. Babe Ruth was considered sacred by a lot of people. And he saved those letters. He has them stored in a trunk in his house. And so he's reliving that again in this situation. But there's a couple of things. I'm not sure if he truly called Republicans Ku Klux Klan, because after that story appeared in USA Today, Bob Nightingale, who wrote the story, wrote a clarification. And in the clarification he said, quote, "Never in our 50-minute conversation did Aaron suggest anyone critical of President Obama is racist. Never did he compare the Republican Party to the Ku Klux Klan." I think what happened is that when you speak and you put Ku Klux Klan in the same, not sentence, but paragraph with Republicans and hoods and starched shirts and neckties, people jump and make their own interpretations.
Okay. Marcio, what do you think?
I think this is a very sensitive issue in this country, and I don't think we should start on this kind of generalization. So I think it's a mistake to make this kind of
jump.
Exactly.
Right.
You cannot do this jump.
Right.
So since it's a very sensitive issue, so I think we need to move with a lot of caution at that, because bringing the Ku Klux Klan and we have an Afro-American president, and we have a division that is so deep in this country between the two parties right now that accusing one of the parties of things like that, it's something that breaks this political system apart. So we don't need that in America right now.
Do you think, Nick, the controversy that he's created is warranted, or do you think that his quote was clearly taken out of context and that the comparison is not valid?
I mean, I think that the reaction to his comments are all of the proof that's required for what he was saying. Now we've certainly made progress over the past 150 years, but in a lot of ways, the Civil War is still being fought in this country. Just look at our drug policy. I mean, one look at that shows you that African Americans and whites use marijuana at about the same rates, but the arrest ratio for African Americans is several times that which is white. So is the incarceration rate from that. Their terms that they receive from that are also longer. That is systemic inequality. One more example that I'll give is during the financial crisis in 2008, major banks like Wells Fargo in particular specifically targeted minorities, African Americans and Latinos, for the subprime loans that they were offering in these low-income communities. That, again, is institutionalized inequality. And while both Bush and Obama were busy giving multi-trillion-dollar bailouts to those same banks, those poor people, those African Americans and those Latinos, were the ones who were suffering foreclosures and forced to hand over their homes to those same banks. That's institutionalized inequality.
Okay. I don't want to get too far off on a tangent, but I do have to respond to a few things that Nick said. One, I think libertarians especially agree that there are significant problems with our drug policies, and libertarians are definitely working along with Democrats to change that. But in regards to what you said about the housing crisis, there were actual I don't want to say quotas, but there was a lot of pressure on a lot of financial institutions to give out loans to certain demographics. And that was part of it. That was coming from the government. So, I mean, if you're a bank, you don't want to give someone a loan where they're going to default. That's just not in your interest. Yes, there were other situations going on in the financial crisis where banks necessarily weren't held accountable. That's a different topic.
Okay.
Going back to the original story, I think regardless of what he actually meant when he was saying those statements, that doesn't matter anymore because it's brought up the topic. And people are asking, okay, are Republicans really similar to the Ku Klux Klan? Which clearly is not the case.
Right.
I think it's true that there is a lot of, there are still racists in this country. That is clearly the truth. People have prejudices. People are biased. But, I mean, Barack Obama being elected twice, that is proof that we have come very far from the 1960s. He was reelected twice. We're not completely perfect yet. We never will be. And I think what we should really be focusing on is, how African American males doing under Barack Obama. They're not doing very well. In fact, they're much worse off since he's been elected president. Yeah. And one of the things that's going to make it worse is if we pass a minimum wage of $10.10, who's going to lose jobs more than anyone else? It's going to be African American males. Democrats are opposed to school choice. Republicans are more in favor of school choice. And what do African American males need the most? Education.
Okay. All right, I'm going to have to move on to taking some questions from our viewers. We have Tracy Powers who asks, if Putin wants to take Ukraine, why hasn't he already invaded it?
Oh, he's not going to invade Ukraine. Yeah. It's going to make him weak. The strategy there, it's like in Crimea. You spread, you whistle, and you wait until the situation gets unstable, and then you infiltrate, the country falls apart, and then you get in to save the Russians that were there. That's his strategy. Because if he invades, he's going to become weak in front of all the international arena. Mm-hmm. All the other countries then could do something.
Gregory?
Well, I'm going back to something I said earlier in regards to the agreement. It's just a matter of hoping that there's some juice behind this, that it will be valid, and the occupation of the buildings, and also the spin-off military groups will cease and desist. Mm-hmm. Because Barack Obama said a couple of days ago during this news conference that the military option is off the table. So the only thing left is what? Sanctions,
diplomacy.
Diplomacy, right?
Mhm.
You know?
Yeah.
So yeah,
I mean, it should be off the table. Like I said previously, an invasion of Ukraine really isn't in the cards. You know, Putin has secured what he needed from Ukraine. Crimea. It was that access to Black Sea ports and oil. So his interest now is to destabilize the country, not through a direct invasion, but by keeping military forces on the border and by tacitly supporting the rebels who are taking over these buildings and such.
I mean, I definitely don't think Putin's going to invade, because part of his game is saying that, this is, the Ukrainians want to be part of Russia. I mean, that just kind of gives away his, whole ploy. I think the question is, what is Putin's Achilles heel? And I don't think we really know yet. He has a lot of pride, and he's willing to do anything to keep it.
Right.
However, he did admit that if he were drowning, and Barack Obama was the only person out there to throw him a life raft, he thought Barack Obama would throw him the life raft. Because he had that 4-hour Q&A the other day with RT, the Russian TV, and someone from the audience, asked him, "Do you think Barack Obama would save you if you were a drowning man?" And he said, something like, President Obama, is a nice guy, good guy. Sure, he would save me.
The question is, would Putin save him?
That's the question. And
well,
someone asked him,
he'll let him drown. Yeah.
I think we should take away from this that our president is trustworthy, and that's great. All right. Peter Gibson asked, Paul Ryan talks about race and gets criticized in public. Hank Aaron talks about race on hate mail. Both don't know how. Don't both know how to nationalize the conversation about race in public. Is it impossible?
Who wants to take it first? Go ahead.
The conversation isn't going away because it hasn't changed. I mean, that's the fundamental point at the heart of this. Like I said, in the drug policy, in the banks' policies, in the federal policy towards them, to a point that Brianna made earlier, is actually the regulation of federal housing that put that pressure on banks to federally to actually lend low-interest loans. So it's both parties that are responsible here. It's not enough to say that because we have an African-American president now, African-Americans are taken care of, and we've succeeded in our 150-year-long quest, to bring African-Americans to the level of parity with the rest of us.
Do you think the discussion about race nationally should be a little bit more mature, as Peter Gibson's implying?
Well, I think we should be less politically correct. For example, the statement, if I say that, more African-American males are incarcerated because they commit more violent crimes, that shouldn't make me a racist. That should, I'm someone who's
above that rate,
reporting the facts.
But it's way above that rate. It's way above the level of crime.
So here's the
that's
thing.
Also ignoring the role of poverty.
Well, let's up here.
Here's part of the problem. Oftentimes, the most extreme people have the loudest voices, and those tend to be the voices that we hear, and they kind of flood out all the moderate voices. But I think there's tough issues. So we can talk about school choice, for example, or we can talk about high school dropout rates. I think there are big problems that are happening in this country, and they impact certain demographics more than the others. And there's a lot of different factors that weigh into that. But I do not think, I think too often the left defaults to racism as being the reason why certain demographics aren't doing well. And I think that at some point people have to take responsibility and look at the deeper issues. And I hope we can have those conversations without name calling.
I actually don't think it's racism that's the heart of it. I think it's classism. I think it's both whites and blacks that are poor who are being suppressed. And in the same way.
I agree with him on that, 100%.
And
you agree with him?
Yeah.
So let's make a clarification.
If I could say one more thing, though, it's also the fact that there's two basic perspectives here. There's the perspective that either you believe that African Americans and other minorities are somehow inherently, genetically more violent than other people, or you accept that a greater prevalence of violence is a product of the circumstances in which they're raised and in which they live, the greater poverty.
Right.
And I think that's
we need
I
to
think
be,
that well, yeah, that's the point.
Exactly.
We need to be more mature about this issue. But this president was elected by minorities, right? And I ask you, what has he done about minorities? For
Deporting
example,
2 million.
immigration reform.
Right.
Right.
He's deporting like
2 million.
the sum
Right.
of from George Washington to George W. Bush.
Right.
He's deporting illegal immigrants tons.
Right.
Yeah, and as Brianna said earlier, the unemployment rate for black folk, especially young black folk, is sky high.
Right.
And I think a lot of times when people, I think the word racism is used too much, entirely too much. I think it's more so what Nick was saying is classism.
I agree.
And that classism is perpetuated by both black, white, Hispanic, whatever. Because some people say that there's a certain class of people based on socio-economic background I don't want to be associated with. And that's more classism, I believe, than racism.
All right, thank you. I have to move on now. Now it's time for our most unreported story of the week.
I'll start us off.
Okay.
All right. So this has been happening a lot within the past couple of months, but I'm not sure if anyone here is familiar with electronic cigarettes. I'm not a smoker of traditional tobacco cigarettes or electronic cigarettes. I'm a runner. I can't harm my lungs. But recently, in case anyone doesn't know what electronic cigarettes are, they're basically like vaporized cigarettes. They don't have the harmful tobacco like tobacco cigarettes have. However, they also have nicotine. And a lot of people, in fact, most people use them to get off of tobacco cigarettes, and it's improved their health significantly. However, a lot of people, lawmakers, health officials are concerned that the popularity of e-cigarettes will renormalize tobacco cigarettes. So they've gone and they've banned them in multiple local governments. So in fact, tonight at 12 o'clock, or I guess Saturday, Los Angeles will enforce a new law that basically restricts e-cigarettes just like they would restrict tobacco cigarettes. And I think the health consequences are going to be pretty adverse.
Interesting. Nick, your most unreported story?
Mine was a story that surfaced in Huffington Post and also by the senator from Vermont, Bernie Sanders, the independent. And he revealed, he basically dug up the 1980 Libertarian Party platform. Now, this is a party platform in which David Koch, a member of the Koch brothers, who have spent more than any other fundraisers in the United States, are basically the primary constituent, what you think of when you say the American oligarchy. It's them. Now, looking through their party platform at that time, you realize what their vision is, and you really need to contrast that with what the American people think. I'll give some examples. Defunding Medicaid, defunding Medicare,
Social Security,
defunding Social Security, eliminating the Department of Transportation, eliminating Federal Housing Authority, eliminating child safety regulations, eliminating all assistance for mothers and childbirth, privatizing all inland waterways and roads. You know, and people need to ask themselves, and the elimination of income taxes, capital gains taxes, eventual elimination of all taxes. People need to ask themselves, is this the vision that I have? You know, this is like reading 1984, reading this platform. You know, it's one world corporate government. You know, it's just insane. So people really need to ask themselves, is that they really need to realize that this is a threat to their democracy.
I really would like to respond to that later.
Interesting story. Marcio, what's your story of the week?
My story is the role played by Susana Martinez, the governor from New Mexico, who is being considered as one important key for the Republican Party in the elections to come for the presidential election. Susana Martinez is the governor from New Mexico. She was Democrat in the past. She's in the executive office now. She is Hispanic and she's a woman. So senior members at the Republican Party that I've talked to are considering Susana Martinez as the vice president of their dreams. So she could play a big role in the ticket with whoever is the candidate. Mm-hmm. So we can think about Chris Christie and Susana Martinez, Jeb Bush and Susana Martinez. That would bring the vote the Hispanic vote, the minority vote, the women vote to the Republican Party, especially when you are facing Hillary Clinton at your side.
I would love to see that in the race. Gregory, what is your story of the week?
Yes, I'm really surprised that the situation in Detroit isn't getting more publicity, especially this week with the arrests going on. The situation is this. I'm trying to make it short. The background. A white motorist was driving to a predominantly black neighborhood in the Detroit area, hit a black child, I think it was 10 years old. He got out of his pickup truck to see if he was okay, and tried to call, using his cell phone to call for help. Next thing you know, he was attacked by 12 to 15 black teenagers. He was brutally beaten. He's in a coma in the hospital, still in the hospital. And one of the questions that's lingering now is it a hate crime? Is it not a hate crime? White motorists, 12, 15 black teens. And it also raises other questions. White drivers in black neighborhoods. And that's something most people don't want to talk about. But there's a lot of ramifications in this case, and I'm surprised I don't hear more about it, especially on cable TV, which really drives the news cycle in the United States these days.
Very interesting story. That's all we have for this week. Thanks for tuning into the Square Circle. We'll see you next week.